The Varaxian pleasure arena was old beyond measure, and its black stone walls had witnessed more death than any living creature could count. For 6,000 years, the arena had stood at the heart of the empire, a monument to power and cruelty, a place where conquered species were brought to die for the entertainment of the ruling class. Tonight the stands were packed with 12,000 Varaxians, their insect-like bodies clicking and buzzing with excitement, their compound eyes gleaming. In the torchlight that flickered along the walls, Grand Arbiter Kethril sat upon his throne of polished bone, looking down at the pit below with an expression of pure satisfaction. He was the master of this place, the one who decided who lived and who died. And tonight he had prepared something special for his loyal subjects. 2 human juveniles had been captured from a colonial transport ship 3 weeks ago, and Kethril had been waiting for just the right moment to use them. Humans were fascinating creatures, according to all the reports. Their home world was filled with violence and war, their history a long record of murder and conquest and destruction. They killed each other over resources, over beliefs, over nothing at all. Surely their children would be no different. Kethril clicked his mandibles together in anticipation as he raised one clawed hand. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his command. Below in the pit, the sandy floor was stained dark with the blood of countless victims, and the smell of death hung heavy in the recycled air. 2 gates stood on opposite sides of the circular arena, each one sealed with heavy metal bars. Behind those gates, the human cubs waited. Kethril brought his hand down sharply, and the gates began to rise. From the left gate came a boy, perhaps 12 standard years old by human counting. He was thin and pale, his dark hair matted with dirt, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage that had turned brown with dried blood. He stumbled as he entered the arena, blinking against the sudden brightness of the torches, and the crowd laughed at his weakness. From the right gate came a girl of similar age, her skin a shade darker than the boy, her hair cut short and uneven as if someone had hacked at it with a dull blade. Her face was streaked with the tracks of dried tears, but her eyes burned with something that was not quite fear. It was defiance, pure and hot, and it made a few of the watching Varaxians shift uncomfortably in their seats. The 2 children stood on opposite sides of the pit, staring at each other across 30 meters of blood-soaked sand between them. Scattered across the arena floor lay an assortment of crude weapons that the arena masters had provided: clubs and knives and sharpened sticks, enough to ensure that the coming battle would be long and painful and entertaining. The crowd began to chant, their alien voices rising in a thunderous wave of sound that shook the very walls of the arena. They wanted blood, and they had been promised blood, and they would not be denied. Kethril leaned forward on his throne, his compound eyes fixed on the 2 small figures below. Any moment now, the human instinct for violence would take over. The children would grab the weapons and attack each other with the savage fury that was the birthright of their species. He had seen it happen 100 times before with other races, and humans were supposed to be the worst of all. But the children did not move toward the weapons. The boy took 1 step forward, his wounded arm hanging limp at his side, and then he did something that made the crowd fall completely silent. He dropped to his knees, not in surrender, not in submission, but in greeting. His hands came up in front of his chest and began to move in a complex pattern, fingers forming shapes that had no meaning to any Varaxian watching. The girl's eyes went wide with shock, and her mouth fell open in an expression of pure disbelief. She raised her own hands and moved them in response, her fingers dancing through the air with desperate speed. The boy signed something back, and tears began to stream down the girl's face. She ran toward him, not with violence, but with something else entirely, something that the Varaxians had no word for in their language. She fell to her knees beside him and wrapped her arms around his thin shoulders, and he buried his face against her neck and sobbed. The crowd did not understand what they were witnessing. They muttered and buzzed in confusion. their excitement turning to bewilderment. What kind of trick was this? Why were the humans embracing instead of fighting? Cathral rose from his throne, his mandibles clicking with anger. This was not what he had planned. This was not entertaining at all. He gestured to his advisors, demanding an explanation, and a nervous translator stepped forward with a portable device. The device had been designed to interpret human communication, including their strange hand language. The translator studied the recording of what the children had signed to each other, and his compound eyes widened with surprise. What did they say? Cathral demanded. The translator's voice was barely a whisper. As he answered, the boy asked if she could understand him, and she said yes. And then he said that he thought he was alone, and she said that she thought she was alone too. And then they both said they were not alone anymore. Cathral stared down at the two children, huddled together in the center of the arena. They were both deaf. He realized they could not hear the crowd's chanting or the guards' commands or even each other's voices. They've been isolated in their own silent worlds, surrounded by captors who could not communicate with them, terrified and hopeless and utterly alone. And then they had found each other across a universe of horror. Across the vastness of space and the cruelty of their captors, they had discovered the one person who could understand them, the one person who knew what it meant to live in silence, the one person who could make them feel less alone in the stands. 12,000 Varaxians sat in uncomfortable silence, not understanding what they were seeing but sensing somehow that it was important. The chanting had stopped, and no one seemed willing to restart it. The children remained on their knees in the sand, holding each other, their hands moving in quiet conversation that no one else could follow. For the first time in 6,000 years, the Varaxian pleasure arena had witnessed something other than death. It had witnessed connection, and deep in his heart, in a place he would never acknowledge, Grand Arbiter Cathral felt the first cold stirring of something that might have been doubt. The silence in the arena stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and the crowd grew restless in their seats. They had paid good credits for this spectacle, and they expected to see violence, not whatever strange ritual the human cubs were performing in the sand below. Grand Arbiter Cathral felt their displeasure like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He had built his reputation on delivering entertainment, on giving the people what they craved, and now these two small creatures were making a fool of him. His compound eyes scanned the arena floor, taking in the scattered weapons that remained untouched. The two children still kneeling together with their hands moving in that silent language. The boy's name was Marcus, according to the manifest from the captured transport ship, and the girl was called Zara. Not that their names mattered to Cathral. What mattered was that they were ruining his show. He turned to his chief arena master, a scarred veteran named Vothkar, who had overseen countless executions in this very pit. Release the pain inducers. Cathral commanded. Vothkar hesitated for just a moment, his mandibles twitching with uncertainty. Grand Arbiter, the cubs are very young, and the pain inducers are designed for adult combatants, so the effect might be more severe than intended. I do not care about severity, Cathral replied coldly. I care about results, and you will give me results, or you will join them in the pit. Vothkar bowed his head and activated the controls. From hidden compartments in the arena walls, a swarm of tiny machines emerged into the torchlight. The pain inducer drones were elegant in their cruelty, each one no larger than a human fingernail, but capable of delivering electrical shocks that could reduce a grown warrior to a screaming wreck. The drones descended toward the children like a cloud of angry insects, and the crowd leaned forward with renewed interest. Now they would see what they had come to see. Now the human cubs would fight. Marcus saw the drones first, his eyes going wide with terror as the machines surrounded him and Zara in a buzzing circle. He tried to sign something to her, tried to warn her, but there was no time. The first shock hit him like a bolt of lightning, and his body convulsed as every nerve ending exploded with agony. he collapsed into the sand, his back arching. His mouth open in a silent scream that no one could hear. Zara felt the vibration of his fall and turned to see her new friend writhing in pain on the arena floor. The drones were clustering around him, delivering shock after shock, and his small body jerked with each impact like a puppet on broken strings. She did not think about what she did next. There was no calculation, no strategy, no weighing of costs and benefits. There was only the sight of someone like her, someone who understood her, someone who had looked at her and seen a person instead of a victim. She threw herself over his body. The drones immediately redirected their attention to this new target, and Zara felt the first shock tear through her muscles like fire made solid. The pain was beyond anything she had ever experienced, beyond anything she had imagined possible. And yet she did not move. She pressed her face against Marcus's shoulder and wrapped her arms around him and held on. The crowd watched in stunned silence as shock after shock rippled through the girl's small frame. Her body spasmed and twitched, her fingers digging into the sand, but she refused to let go of the boy beneath her. She was shielding him. They realized she was taking the punishment meant for both of them. Some of the Varaxians laughed at this display, finding it amusing that the girl thought she could protect him from the pain. Others fell quiet, their compound eyes fixed on the spectacle below with an expression that might have been confusion or might have been something else entirely. Kethro ordered the voltage increased. For 1 hour, the torture continued, and then another, and then a third. The children lay tangled together in the blood-stained sand, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their skin marked with burns from the electrical shocks. But still they did not fight during a brief pause in the assault. Marcus's hands moved weakly against Zara's arms. Why? He sighed, his fingers barely able to form the shape. Zara's response was slow and clumsy, her muscles refusing to obey her commands. But she managed to spell out her answer against his palm where he could feel it. Because you are like me. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sand and the sweat and the blood in all his life. In all the years of isolation and misunderstanding, no one had ever said those words to him. No one had ever looked at him and seen themselves. No one had ever thought he was worth protecting. He shifted his position slightly, moving so that his body covered more of hers, so that when the drones attacked again, they would have to go through him to reach her. Zara felt what he was doing and tried to push him back, tried to keep herself between him and the pain. But he would not let her. They struggled weakly against each other, not with violence but with desperation, each one trying to sacrifice themselves for the other. In the stands, a young Varaxian female watched this struggle with growing discomfort. She was barely out of her juvenile stage herself, brought to the arena by her parents as a treat for her naming day celebration. She had expected to enjoy the violence, expected to feel the thrill of watching inferior species destroy each other. But instead she felt something twisting in her stomach. She turned to her broodmate, a male of similar age, who sat beside her with an expression of bewilderment. And she asked a question that had never been spoken aloud in 6,000 years of the arena's bloody history. Why won't they fight? Her broodmate had no answer, neither did her parents. Neither did any of the 12,000 Varaxians who sat in that ancient arena, watching two small humans refuse to harm each other even as their bodies were torn apart by pain. The torture finally stopped when Vothkar reported that the children's vital signs were becoming dangerously unstable. Kethril waved his hand in disgust and ordered the drones to withdraw. The show was over for tonight, though it had been nothing like the show he had intended, as the children were dragged from the arena by armored guards, barely conscious and leaving trails of blood in the sand. The crowd began to file out in unusual silence. There was none of the excited chatter that usually followed a good night's entertainment, none of the animated discussion of favorite kills and memorable moments. Instead, the Varaxians walked quietly through the ancient corridors, lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed in the medical bay beneath the arena. Marcus and Zara were thrown into the same cell and left to heal or die as fate decided. They crawled toward each other in the darkness, their burned and broken bodies screaming with every movement. And they held hands through the long night. Neither of them could hear the other's heartbeat, but they could feel it through their touching skin, and that was enough. That was everything. By dawn, the recordings had spread beyond the arena walls and into the vast network that connected every corner of the Varaxian Empire. Someone in the crowd had captured the entire spectacle on a personal device, and that someone had shared it with friends, who had shared it with their own friends, who had shared it further still, until millions of eyes had witnessed what happened in the pit. The recording did not show violence or death, which was unusual for arena footage. Instead, it showed two small humans embracing in the sand, their hands moving in silent conversation, their bodies shielding each other from the pain-inducer drones. Comments flooded in from across the Empire, and for once, they were not demands for more blood or complaints about disappointing entertainment. They were questions. Why did the cubs not fight? What were they saying to each other? Why did the female throw herself over the male? Why did he try to cover her in return? The Varaxian High Council took notice of the growing unrest and summoned a gathering of scholars to explain what the public had witnessed. Surely, there was a simple explanation. The councilors reasoned surely the humans were defective in some way, damaged goods that should never have been put in the arena in the first place. The scholars arrived at the Grand Council chamber with their data tablets and their research files, eager to provide answers that would satisfy their rulers. The first to speak was a geneticist named Corathan, who specialized in the biological analysis of conquered species. The humans appear to be fully functional examples of their species, he reported, his mandibles clicking nervously under the council's intense scrutiny. Their genomes show no abnormalities that would explain their behavior, and their brain scans indicate normal patterns of activity for juveniles of their age. Then why did they not fight? Demanded Councillor Vexenal, the eldest member of the body. Every database confirms that humans are violent by nature, that their history is an endless parade of war and murder. So why did these cubs embrace instead of kill? Corathan spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. I cannot explain behavior. Counselor, only biology, and biologically speaking, the humans are exactly what we expected them to be. The next scholar was a psychologist named Threxid, who had spent decades studying the mental patterns of various species. Perhaps the cubs are simply too young to have developed proper aggressive instincts, she suggested. Perhaps their violent nature emerges later in development, after they reach physical maturity. But this theory was quickly dismissed by another scholar, who pointed out that human juvenile violence was well documented in their own records. Children as young as these two had committed murders on their home world, had formed gangs, and waged wars in the streets of their city's. Age was not the explanation. The council grew increasingly frustrated as scholar after scholar failed to provide satisfactory answers. They were about to dismiss the gathering entirely, when a quiet voice spoke from the back of the chamber. If I may offer a perspective. All eyes turned to the speaker, an elderly female named Yethmora, who had been silent throughout the proceedings. She was ancient by Varaxian standards, her exoskeleton dulled with age, her movements slow and careful. But her mind remained sharp, and her reputation as a xenanthropologist was unmatched in the Empire. She had spent her entire career studying other species, not as enemies to be conquered, but as cultures to be understood. It was an unusual perspective for a Varaxian, and it had earned her both respect and suspicion in equal measure. Speak then, Councillor Vexenal commanded. Tell us why these humans refuse to behave as humans should. Yethmora moved slowly to the center of the chamber, her old joints creaking with each step. "You are all operating under a fundamental misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "You believe that violence is the defining characteristic of humanity, but you are wrong." A murmur of surprise rippled through the council. This was not what they had expected to hear. The humans are capable of terrible violence. HFY continued. "This is true and well documented, but violence is not what made them the dominant species on their world, and violence is not what allowed them to spread across the stars." She activated a display screen and brought up images from human history. Not the wars and genocides that the council was familiar with, but other scenes entirely: humans pulling each other from burning buildings, humans sharing food with strangers during times of famine, humans risking their lives to save members of other species from danger. What made humans successful is their capacity for what they call empathy. HFY explained. It is the ability to look at another being and recognize a piece of themselves, to feel what the other feels, to suffer when the other suffers. That is weakness. Counselor Vexenal interrupted. That is the kind of softness that gets species conquered. With respect. Counselor, I disagree. HFY replied calmly. Empathy is not weakness, but strength of a kind we Varaxians have never cultivated. And the proof of this is what we witnessed in the arena. She brought up the recording of Marcus and Zara, freezing the image at the moment when Zara threw herself over the boy's body. These children had never met before that night. HFY said. They came from different families, different regions of space, different lives entirely, and yet the female chose to suffer for the male without hesitation. And the male tried to do the same for her. She turned to face the council directly, her compound eyes reflecting the glow of the display screen. They did not fight because they looked at each other and saw themselves. And humans cannot harm what they see as part of themselves. And this is not defect or damage, but the very core of their nature. You are saying that humans are capable of both extreme violence and extreme self-sacrifice? Asked a younger counselor with confusion in his voice. Precisely, HFY confirmed. Humans are not simply violent, they are selective. And they can choose who receives their violence and who receives their protection. And once another being has been accepted into what they call their circle of care, they will die before they allow harm to come to that person. The council sat in troubled silence as they absorbed this information. It was a disturbing revelation. Far more disturbing than simple mindless aggression would have been. Mindless aggression could be predicted and controlled. But a species that could choose when to kill and when to sacrifice. A species that could form unbreakable bonds with complete strangers in a matter of moments. That was something else entirely. These children, HFY concluded, her voice soft but firm, are not defective examples of humanity. They are perfect examples. And what they demonstrated in that arena was not weakness, but the very trait that allowed their species to conquer their world. And it was not violence. She paused, letting her words sink in. It was love. The word hung in the air of the council chamber, foreign and uncomfortable, and no one knew quite how to respond. For the first time in living memory, the Varaxian High Council had encountered an enemy they did not know how to fight. 3 days had passed since the spectacle in the pit, and Grand Arbiter Kethrol was growing desperate. The human cubs had been given time to heal, pumped full of medical compounds that accelerated their recovery. And tonight they would return to the arena floor. This time, Kethrol had promised himself. Things would be different. He had studied the recordings carefully, analyzed every moment of their strange behavior. And he believed he understood what had gone wrong. The children had found common ground in their shared disability. Their deafness creating a bond that overrode their natural instincts. The solution was simple. He would give them no choice but to fight. But as the sun set and the crowds began to gather, something unusual happened. The stands did not fill as they normally did. Merchants, reported lower sales of refreshments and souvenirs. And the betting houses saw only a fraction of their typical activity. One food vendor, a middle-aged Varaxian named Krethmal, who had worked the arena for 30 years, simply refused to open his stall when security officers demanded an explanation. He struggled to articulate his feelings. "It does not feel right," he said, his mandibles clicking with uncertainty. "I have seen many deaths in this place, and I have never questioned them. But those children, the way they held each other, I cannot stop thinking about it." He was not alone in this sentiment throughout the arena. Workers and spectators alike displayed a strange reluctance that none of them fully understood. They had come to see violence, as they always did, but the memory of what they had witnessed 3 nights ago sat heavy in their minds like an undigested meal. Still, enough Varaxians filled the stands to satisfy Kethral's pride. And as the torches were lit and the drums began to sound, he rose from his throne to address the crowd. "Citizens of the Empire," he announced, his voice amplified by the ancient sound system built into the arena walls. "Tonight you will witness the conclusion of our human spectacle, and I promise you that this time there will be blood." The crowd responded with cheers. Though they seemed less enthusiastic than usual, the gates opened, and Marcus and Zara were pushed into the arena by armored guards. They looked better than they had 3 days ago. Their burns mostly healed, and their movements no longer stiff with pain. But fear was written clearly on their young faces. They immediately moved toward each other, their hands already signing rapidly as they tried to share information and comfort. Kethral smiled a cold smile and gave the signal from the largest gate in the arena, the one reserved for special occasions. Came a sound that made the blood freeze in the veins of everyone present. It was a roar, deep and rumbling, the sound of something massive and hungry and very, very angry. The Thornback emerged into the torchlight like a nightmare made flesh. It stood 3 meters tall at the shoulder, its body covered in overlapping plates of natural armor that could deflect most weapons. Its claws were each as long as a human arm, curved and razor-sharp, designed by evolution for tearing prey apart with brutal efficiency. Its eyes, small and red and filled with rage, fixed immediately on the 2 small figures. In the center of the arena, the crowd gasped with excitement and horror. This was more like what they had come to see. This was entertainment worthy of the Varaxian pleasure. Arena Marcus and Zara saw the beast and understood immediately that they were going to die. There were no weapons nearby, no shelter to hide behind, no possible way for 2 small humans to defeat such a monster. Marcus turned to Zara and signed quickly with trembling hands. "I am sorry I could not protect you," Zara signed back, tears streaming down her face. "You did protect me. You made me not alone." That was enough. The Thornback charged. It crossed the arena floor with terrifying speed, its clawed feet tearing gouges in the sand, its mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth designed for crushing bone. Marcus stepped in front of Zara, spreading his thin arms wide as if he could somehow shield her from the oncoming death. He knew it was hopeless, knew that one swipe of those claws would end both their lives. But he could not let her face it alone. He would not let the last thing she saw be a monster. He would make sure the last thing she saw was someone who cared about her. The beast was 10 meters away now. Then 5, and the crowd was on their feet, screaming with anticipation, and then something unexpected happened. A piece of metal came flying down from the stands and struck the Thornback on the side of its armored head. The impact was not enough to hurt the creature, but it was enough to startle it, and it skidded to a halt just meters from the children, swinging its head around to search for the source of the attack. High in the stands, a young Varaxian female stood with her arms still extended from the throw. It was the same female who had asked, "Why won't they fight?" 3 nights ago. and she had spent every hour since then unable to forget what she had seen. She did not fully understand why she had thrown the piece of metal torn from her own seat. She only knew that she could not watch those children die without doing something. Anything, to try and stop it. Another piece of debris sailed down from the stands, thrown by an elderly male on the opposite side of the arena. Then another, and suddenly objects were raining down from all directions. Varaxians who had come seeking blood were now hurling everything they could grab at the confused beast in the pit: food containers and seat cushions and pieces of jewelry and anything else that came to hand. The Thornback roared with confusion and anger, turning in circles as it tried to identify the threat. It had been trained to kill prey in the arena, not to deal with attacks from above. Its small brain could not process what was happening, and it began to retreat toward its gate, seeking escape from this bewildering situation. Kethril screamed orders at his guards, demanding that they stop the crowd, but the guards hesitated. Many of them had also seen the recording, had also spent sleepless nights wondering why the human children would not fight, and they were not eager to turn their weapons on their own people in the chaos. A single Varaxian soldier made a decision that would change history. His name was Vorth, and he was the same veteran who had walked out of the arena 3 nights ago. After seeing something in the girl's eyes that he could not forget, he had seen courage before. The courage of warriors facing death in battle. But this had been different. This had been the courage to suffer for someone else, to die for someone you had just met, simply because you recognized them as worthy of protection. He stepped forward and opened the gate that led out of the arena. The children saw the opening and did not hesitate. Marcus grabbed Zara's hand and they ran, their bare feet pounding against the sand, their hearts racing with desperate hope. Behind them, the Thornback bellowed with frustrated rage. But the rain of debris kept it at bay just long enough for the children to reach safety. The crowd's cheering had transformed into something else now. Something that sounded almost like celebration for the first time in 6,000 years. The audience of the Varaxian Pleasure Arena had chosen to save a life instead of taking one. Kethril watched in horrified disbelief as his spectacle collapsed around him. The crowd was not angry about the ruined show. They were elated, energized, more excited than he had ever seen them. But their excitement was not for death, it was for life. And somewhere in the tunnels, beneath the arena, a human boy and a human girl ran hand in hand toward an uncertain future, still not knowing that they had just started a revolution. The chaos that followed the failed execution spread through the arena. Like fire through dry grass, Varaxians who had spent their entire lives accepting the cruelty of the Empire suddenly found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. It started with whispers in the corridors and grew into shouts in the streets, and finally erupted into a full confrontation at the gates of the arena itself. Grand Arbiter Kethril called for reinforcements, ordering his personal guard to restore order by any means necessary. But when the soldiers arrived, led by Commander Vorth himself, they did not move to suppress the crowd. Instead, they formed a protective line around the gathered citizens. Their weapons pointed not at the protesters, but at the arena guards who sought to silence them. Kethril watched from his throne as his power crumbled before his eyes. "You will all be executed for this treason," he screamed, his mandibles clicking with impotent rage. "I am the Grand Arbiter, and I speak with the authority of the Empire itself." Commander Vorth stepped forward, his scarred face calm and resolute. "The Empire is not this arena," he replied, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "The Empire is its people, and the people have made their choice." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered behind him. "For 6,000 years, we have come to this place to watch others suffer and die. And we have told ourselves that this is strength, that this is power, that this is what it means to be Varaxian. But I saw something in this arena that showed me a different kind of strength." He gestured toward the tunnel where Marcus and Zara had disappeared. Those children had every reason to hate each other. Every reason to fight for their own survival at the expense of the other. And yet they chose differently. They chose to protect each other, to suffer for each other, to die for each other if necessary. And I have led soldiers into battle for 30 years, and I have never seen courage like that. The crowd roared its approval. And more Varaxians were arriving by the minute, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of soldiers. Standing with civilians against the arena authority, Kethro made one final attempt to assert control, ordering his remaining loyal guards to arrest Commander Vareth and anyone who stood with him. But the guards looked at the growing crowd, looked at the soldiers who opposed them, and slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. By midnight, Grand Arbiter Kethro was in custody, and the arena was in the hands of a hastily formed citizen council. But this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the events at the arena became the most discussed topic in the entire Varaxian Empire. The recording of Marcus and Zara protecting each other was viewed billions of times, analyzed by scholars, debated by politicians, and wept over by ordinary citizens who found themselves moved by feelings they did not know how to name. Yethmora, the elderly xenanthropologist who had addressed the High Council, became an unlikely celebrity. Her theory about human empathy and selective compassion was discussed in universities and homes across the empire, and her writings on the subject were translated into every Varaxian dialect. Reform movements that had struggled in obscurity for centuries suddenly found themselves with millions of supporters. They called their ideology the Pit Testimony, in honor of what the children had demonstrated, and they demanded an end to the gladiatorial games, the liberation of enslaved species, and a fundamental reconsideration of what it meant to be strong. The High Council, sensing which way the wind was blowing, moved quickly to align themselves with the changing mood. They announced the suspension of all arena activities pending review, freed thousands of prisoners who had been destined for execution, and opened diplomatic channels with species they had previously considered beneath notice. The empire did not collapse overnight, and not all Varaxians accepted the new ideas with enthusiasm. There were protests and counter-protests, heated debates and occasional violence, as a civilization struggled to redefine itself after millennia of brutality. But the seed had been planted, and it would not stop growing. 3 months after the events at the arena, Marcus and Zara were returned to human space. Their rescue had been negotiated through the new diplomatic channels, part of a larger agreement that established peaceful relations between the Varaxian Empire and the human colonies for the first time in history. They were met at the border by a delegation that included their families, political leaders, and hundreds of journalists eager to interview the children who had changed the course of galactic history. But Marcus and Zara had little interest in fame or politics. They walked off the transport ship hand in hand, their eyes scanning the crowd until they found the faces they had been longing to see. Their mothers ran to meet them, and for a long moment there was nothing but tears and embraces and the silent language of love that needed no words or signs to be understood. Years later, when the children had grown into adults and the Varaxian reforms had become permanent fixtures of a transformed society, a historian came to interview Zara about her experiences. She was a teacher now, working with deaf children on a colony world, helping them find connection and community, just as she had once found with Marcus. The historian asked many questions about the arena, about the torture, about the moment when the crowd had chosen to save them instead of watching them die. But the question that mattered most came at the end of the interview, during those 3 hours of pain. The historian asked, when the drones were shocking you over and over and there seemed to be no hope of escape, what were you thinking? What kept you holding on? Zara smiled, her hands moving gracefully as she signed her response for the camera. He was scared, she said, and I was scared. But being scared alone is worse than being scared together. So I stayed, and that is the whole truth of it. That is everything I have to teach on the world that had once been home to the Varaxian pleasure arena. A monument now stood where the pit had been. The obsidian walls had been torn down, the blood-stained sand removed, and in their place rose a simple sculpture made of white stone. It depicted two children, kneeling in the sand, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces pressed together in an embrace of absolute trust. The inscription at the base of the monument had been chosen by the citizen council that had overthrown Kethril, and it was written in both Varaxian script and human letters so that all who visited could understand its meaning. They taught us what strength looks like. Every year, on the anniversary of the night that changed everything, Varaxians from across the empire gathered at the monument to remember. They brought their children and their grandchildren, and they told them the story of two small humans who refused to fight, who chose love over violence, who held on to each other through unimaginable pain simply because they had recognized in each other something worth protecting. And somewhere across the galaxy, Marcus and Zara continued to live their quiet lives, rarely speaking of what they had endured, content in the knowledge that they had found each other when they needed it most. They still talked every day, their hands dancing through the air in the language that only they fully understood, sharing joys and sorrows and everything in between. They had been strangers once, thrown together by cruelty and chance. Now they were family, bound by something stronger than blood. They were bound by a choice made in the sand of an arena, a choice to see another person's suffering as their own, a choice to protect instead of destroy. It was the most human choice there was, and it had changed everything.